Story 1. Volunteering at an animal shelter was one of the highlights of my week. The wagging tails, the playful purrs, and the sheer joy that the animals brought to everyone around them made the hard work worthwhile. The shelter was always bustling, during the day filled with people adopting pets and volunteers, caring for the animals. But at night, it was a different story. The lights were dimmed, and the shelter became eerily quiet, the cages empty except for the occasional rustling of bedding. One night I stayed late to help with an event cleaning up after a busy day. As I walked through the shelter, double-checking that all the cages were locked and the animals settled, I noticed something odd. Several cages in the back section had been left open, their doors swinging gently. At first, I thought someone had forgotten to lock them, but then I realized that the animals inside were missing. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't like the animals to wander off, especially not from the back section where the more anxious and less social ones were kept. I called out, hoping to hear the familiar sounds of barking or meowing. Though the shelter was silent, I checked with the night staff, asking if they'd seen anyone or noticed anything unusual. They shrugged, suggesting that maybe the animals had slipped out when the staff went home, but the explanation didn't sit well. With me, these animals weren't the type to roam. They were scared, often recovering from trauma. Something was wrong, and I had to find out what. I decided to review the security footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of what had happened during the night. The shelter had cameras positioned throughout, including the back section where the cages were now empty. As I watched the footage, the timestamps moving slowly through the night, I saw the shelter's familiar shapes and shadows. But then, just past midnight, a dark figure appeared on the screen. At first, it was just a blur, a shadow that seemed to drift between the cages. But as I watched, I realized that its movements were unnatural, almost fluid. Fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. The shape was indistinct, lacking clear edges or definition, but it was unmistakably inhuman. It moved from cage to cage, each time pausing for a moment, and then the cage door would open, the animal inside, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a surge of fear, my heart racing as I watched the footage. This wasn't a typical break-in, and it wasn't a prank. The figure's movements were deliberate, each action smooth and controlled, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. It opened the cages with ease, its dark form slipping through the shadows without making a sound. I called the shelter's manager, waking him in the middle of the night, and explained what I had seen. He was skeptical at first, suggesting that maybe the footage was distorted or there was a technical glitch. But when he arrived and watched the footage, he couldn't deny what he saw. The dark figure, the open cages, the missing animals. It was all too real. The manager called the police, and they arrived shortly after their presence, bringing a sense of urgency to the shelter. They took statements, asked questions, and reviewed the security footage. But even they seemed puzzled by what they saw. The inhuman shape and its eerie movements, defying explanation. The police launched an investigation, searching the surrounding area for any sign of the missing animals or the dark figure from the footage. But they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Just the empty cages and the unsettling footage. It was as if the dark figure had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The shelter's atmosphere changed after that night. The staff were on edge, and the remaining animals seemed restless, as if they sensed the danger. The security was tightened, but the fear lingered, the memory of the dark figures casting a shadow over the shelter. I continued to volunteer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had entered our world. The open cages, the missing animals, and the inhuman movements on the security footage were a mystery that might never be solved. But I knew one thing for sure. The dark figure was out there somewhere, and it wasn't finished with its sinister work. Story 2. The highway stretched for miles, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through barren landscapes. It was the kind of road where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul, the desert stretching out on either side like an endless wasteland. I was on my way to a business meeting in another state, but I'd taken this detour to avoid traffic and get some quiet time on the open road. The day was fading into dusk, the sky turning shades of orange and pink when I passed by an old abandoned gas station. It was a relic from another era, its rusty signs swaying in the breeze, the paint peeling off its walls. Something about it caught my eye, a sense of nostalgia maybe, or just curiosity about what had happened to the place. I slowed down and pulled over, my tires crunching on the gravel. The gas station looked like it hadn't been used in years, the windows boarded up and the pumps covered in dust and cobwebs. But as I got out of my car, I felt a strange pull, like something was drawing me inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning with age. The interior was dark, the faint light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The walls were lined with old shelves, some of them collapsed under the weight of years of neglect. The air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. As I walked through the gas station, I noticed a pile of newspapers on the floor tucked into a corner near the back. They looked out of place, not like the rest of the decaying debris. I picked one up, brushing off the dust, and my eyes widened when I saw the data was from just a few days ago. The headline read, "Person missing in this area." I grabbed another newspaper, then another, each one with the same headline, each one detailing a different disappearance. The stories were all similar. People who had been traveling through the area, who had stopped for gas or to rest, and who had vanished without a trace. The articles mentioned search parties and police investigations, but no leads, no clues as to what had happened to them. A chill ran down my spine as I flipped through the newspapers, each one filled with stories of missing people. I wondered why they were here in this abandoned gas station, far from the nearest town. It felt like a warning, a message for those who ventured into this desolate stretch of highway. I decided to leave, the sense of unease growing with each passing moment. But as I turned to go, I heard a noise from the back of the gas station, a faint shuffling like someone or something was moving in the darkness. I froze, my heart racing, my instincts telling me to run. The shuffling grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was approaching. I backed away, my steps cautious, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the gas station was silent again, the only sound my own breathing, heavy and uneven. I knew I couldn't stay, not after what I'd found, not with the headlines. Repeating in my mind, "Person missing in this area." I left the gas station, the door slamming shut behind me, the echo reverberating through the empty highway. The sky was darker now, the sun a distant memory, and the landscape seemed even more desolate. I got into my car and drove, my headlights cutting through the darkness, the road stretching out before me like a lifeline. The rest of the drive was filled with a sense of urgency, the memory of the abandoned gas station and its ominous newspapers haunting me. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone or something following me down the highway, but there was nothing, just the empty road and the distant howl of the wind. When I reached the next town, I stopped at a small diner and called the local authorities, reporting what I had found. The dispatcher seemed concerned, but not surprised, as if the disappearances were becoming a common occurrence. I knew I had done the right thing, but the fear lingered, the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dark and dangerous. I never took that stretch of highway again, and I avoided driving at night whenever I could. The abandoned gas station, the newspapers, with their chilling headlines, it was all too much to forget. The desolate roads held their secrets, and I knew I was lucky to have escaped without becoming another story in the headlines. Story 3. House sitting for a wealthy family seemed like an easy gig. It was a grand estate, the kind with a long driveway and manicured lawns. The owners were out of town for a few weeks, and my job was to water the plants, feed the pets, and make sure the place didn't fall into disarray. I had the run of the house, which included the study, a cozy room with dark wood paneling, leather-bound, books, and a massive mahogany desk. The study was my favorite spot. It had an air of mystery, filled with old artifacts and curiosities. But there was one thing that always caught my eye. Drawer in the desk locked tight with a heavy padlock. The rest of the desk was accessible, but that drawer was off limits. Naturally, my curiosity was piqued one evening after a day of watching movies and lounging by the pool. I decided to explore the study more thoroughly. The locked drawer was an itch I couldn't scratch, a puzzle begging to be solved. I found a set of keys in the master bedroom tucked away in a jewelry box, and one of them fit the padlock perfectly. The lock clicked open and I slid the drawer out, expecting to find valuables or family heirlooms. Instead, there was a stack of VHS tapes, each one labeled with a name and a date. The names were familiar. They belonged to the family members who owned the house, but the dates ranged from years ago to the present day. What disturbed me most was the most recent tape. It was still recording. I felt a chill run down my spine. As I picked up the tapes, examining the labels, there was a tape for each family member, from the father and mother to the teenage son and daughter. The dates on the labels suggested they were recorded over a period of years, documenting moments from the family's life. But why would the most recent tapes still be recording, and why would it be locked away in a drawer? I took the tapes to the living room, where an old VHS player was connected to a large television. I hesitated, wondering if I should really be watching these tapes, but my curiosity got the better of me. I loaded the first tape, one labeled with the father's name, and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing a static-filled image. Slowly it resolved into a scene of the study, the same room where I had found the tapes. The father was sitting at the desk, typing on a laptop, seemingly unaware that he was being recorded. The angle suggested the camera was hidden, positioned somewhere in the study where it couldn't be seen. I watched as the father worked, answering phone calls and flipping through paperwork. It was mundane at first, but then he stopped, his expression changing to one of fear. He looked around as if sensing something in the room, but there was nothing there. The tape ended abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. I loaded the next tape, this one labeled with the mother's name. It showed her in the kitchen preparing dinner, but again there was a sense of unease. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, as if expecting someone to appear. The same pattern emerged: normal activities followed by sudden moments of fear or suspicion. I continued through the tapes, each one showing a different family member in their own setting. The son playing video games, the daughter talking on her phone. But each time there was a moment of tension, a sense that they were being watched. The final tape, the one still recording, showed an empty room with only the sound of distant voices in the background. I knew I had stumbled upon something sinister, something that suggested the family was under surveillance, but I didn't know why. The tapes, the hidden cameras, the locked drawer, it all pointed to a secret that the family didn't want anyone to know. But who was recording these tapes, and why were they hidden away out of sight? I decided to call the family to tell them what I'd found, but there was no answer. Their phones went straight to voicemail, as if they were out of range or intentionally ignoring calls. The sense of isolation grew, the mansion feeling less like a home and more like a fortress, each room hiding its own secrets. I knew I had to leave, to get out of the house before whatever was happening reached me. I packed my things, grabbing the tapes, and headed for the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard a faint noise from the study, the sound of someone moving through the room. I turned, my heart racing, but the house was silent. The only sound, my own rapid breathing. I left the mansion, the tapes clutched tightly in my hands, the fear following me down the driveway. I knew I had uncovered something dangerous, something that threatened not just the family, but anyone who got too close. The tapes were the key to a man mystery, but the deeper I dug, the more I realized that some secrets were best left locked away. Story 4. Working the night shift as a guard at a correctional facility wasn't glamorous, but it had its moments of excitement. The place was massive, a sprawling complex of concrete and steel, with corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The night shift was typically quiet. Most of the inmates were locked in their cells, and the occasional noise was usually just the result of restlessness or boredom. But on this particular night, something felt off. The air was thicker, the shadows darker, and the usual sounds of the facility seemed muted. My rounds took me through various sections of the facility, each one with its own atmosphere. The older parts were the creepiest, with rusted bars and outdated equipment that hadn't been used in years. The execution chamber was one of those places, a relic from a darker time. It had been closed for years, ever since the state abolished capital punishment, but the chamber still stood a silent reminder of the past. As I walked through the corridor near the execution chamber, I heard a faint whispering. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the wind playing tricks with the old ventilation system, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if someone or something was speaking. Just beyond the chamber's heavy metal door, I hesitated, my flashlight casting erratic beams of light on the walls. The whispering was coming from inside the execution chamber, a place that hadn't been used in years. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The whispers were too faint to make out, but they had a rhythm, a cadence that suggested they were more than just random noise. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The chamber was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight. The air was musty, filled with the scent of old stone and decaying metal. But what caught my attention was the small candle burning on the floor, its flame flickering as if disturbed by a breeze. Next to the candle was a piece of paper, its edges singed and curling from the heat. I picked up the paper, my heart racing as I saw what was written on it. It was my name, spelled out in ashes, the letters carefully formed and precise. I felt a surge of fear, the whispering in the background growing louder like a chorus of voices, rising from the walls. It was as if the chamber itself had come to life, the ghosts of the past, returning to deliver a message. I backed out of the chamber, my hands trembling, the paper clutched tightly in my grip. The whispers followed me, growing more intense, as if they were angry that I'd interrupted them. I shut the door and bolted it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I knew I had to leave to get out of that section of the facility before whatever was in the execution chamber found me. I radioed for backup, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd found. The other guards arrived quickly, their flashlights casting long beams down the corridor. I showed them the paper with my name written in ashes, and they exchanged uneasy glances. The whispering had stopped, the corridor falling silent, but the fear lingered. We checked the security footage, hoping to find some explanation for the candle and the paper, but the camera showed nothing unusual. It was as if the execution chamber had always been empty, the candle and the whispers existing only in my mind. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, and I couldn't dismiss it as a hallucination. The rest of the night was tense, the other guards keeping a close watch on the corridor near the execution chamber. No one else heard the whispers, and the candle was gone by morning, leaving no trace of its existence. The paper with my name in ashes was the only evidence, a chilling reminder that something strange had happened in that chamber. I knew I couldn't stay on the night shift, not after what I'd experienced. The whispers, the candle, the piece of paper with my name, they were all signs that the past had come back to haunt the facility. I requested a transfer to the day shift, hoping that the light of day would dispel the shadows that had gathered in the old execution chamber. But I knew that some shadows were too dark to be erased, and the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Being a courier was supposed to be straightforward. Pick up packages, drop them off, and repeat until the day was done. I liked the job because it gave me freedom time on the road and the occasional conversation with a grateful customer. But one day, everything changed with a single package that wasn't on my delivery list. I was at the warehouse sorting through my deliveries when I noticed a small box among the stacks of packages. It was nondescript, wrapped in plain brown paper, but what caught my eye was the label. No address, just my name, written in bold black letters. I checked with the dispatcher to see if it was a mistake, but he just shrugged and said it might be a personal delivery. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took the package with me as I went about my rounds. I thought about opening it right away, but I decided to wait until I had some time to myself. As I drove through the city, the box sat on the passenger seat, its presence a constant reminder of the unknown. By the end of the day, I found a quiet spot to park and open the package. Inside was a stack of old photographs, each one yellowed with age. They showed people I didn't recognize, strangers in various settings, some in casual poses, others more formal. I sifted through the photos, trying to find a connection, but nothing made sense. Then I found the last photograph. It was more recent, the colors still vibrant, but what disturbed me was the date written on the back. It was today's date, and the image itself showed my face clear as day, standing on a street corner I didn't recognize. I was looking away from the camera, seemingly unaware that the photo was being taken. My heart raced as I examined the photograph. How could this be? I hadn't been to that street corner, and yet there I was, captured in the image as if someone had been following me. I turned the photo over, hoping for more information, but there was nothing else. Just the date, and my face, hauntingly familiar yet entirely out of context. I felt a surge of fear, the realization that someone was watching me, tracking my movements without my knowledge. I checked my surroundings, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one there. The city seemed normal, the traffic, and pedestrians moving along as if nothing had happened. I called my supervisor, explaining what I'd found, but he dismissed it as a prank or a mix-up. "Someone's probably messing with you," he said, his voice casual. "Just forget about it and get back to work." But I couldn't forget about it. The photograph with my face and the current date was too unsettling to ignore. I decided to retrace my steps, driving back through my delivery route, hoping to find the street corner from the photograph. But the city felt different. The familiar streets, now filled with shadows and hidden threats. I stopped at various locations, asking if anyone had seen someone taking photographs, but no one had any information. The sense of unease grew with each passing moment. The photograph, the old photographs of strangers, the package with no address at all, felt like the beginning of something dark and dangerous. I knew I had to be careful to watch my back, because someone out there was watching me. As I drove back to the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Cars seemed to linger behind me, their headlights too close, their drivers hidden in the shadows. I checked my mirrors repeatedly, half expecting to see a familiar face, but there was nothing, just the relentless flow of traffic. When I returned to the warehouse, I handed the package to my supervisor, telling him I didn't want it anymore. He took it with a smirk, as if I were overreacting, but I didn't care. The photograph with my face, the stack of old photographs, it was too eerie, like a warning of something yet to come. I knew I had to be vigilant to stay on high alert, because the package with my name and the photograph with my face suggested that someone was watching, someone who knew more about me than I was comfortable with. The city had changed. the familiar streets now filled with unseen threats, and I had to be careful not to become the next photograph in someone else's collection. Story 6. The fire at the old hotel was devastating. Flames had engulfed the building, reducing what was once a grand landmark to a smoldering heap of rubble. I was part of the investigative team tasked with determining the cause of the fire and looking for any evidence of foul play. The hotel had been abandoned for years, but its history was rich, filled with stories of glamorous guests and scandalous events. The scene was chaotic. Firefighters still dousing hotspots, smoke lingering in the air, and emergency personnel combing through the wreckage. As I walked through the charred remains, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. The echoes of a bygone era now reduced to ashes. The hotel had been undergoing renovations when the fire broke out, and the construction materials had added fuel to the flames. The fire department suspected it was accidental, perhaps a spark from a welder's torch. But my instincts told me there was more to the story. The damage was extensive, the destruction too thorough to be a simple mishap. I made my way to the hotel's basement, where the fire had burned hottest. The walls were blackened, the floor covered with debris and broken glass. As I sifted through the rubble, I noticed a section of the floor that seemed hollow. I tapped it with my boot, and the sound confirmed my suspicion. There was a hidden room beneath the floor. With the help of the firefighters, I cleared away the debris and found a trapdoor partially hidden by fallen beams. It took some effort, but we pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. The air was thick with smoke, but I could feel a draft from below, suggesting there was more to the hidden room than met the eye. I descended the staircase, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hidden room was small, but the walls were intact, untouched by the fire. What caught my attention, though, were the photographs. Hundreds of them, covering every inch of the walls. They were neatly arranged, each one with a name date and time written beneath it. I examined the photographs, realizing that they were all of hotel guests from different eras. The faces were a mix of smiles and solemn expressions, the dates spanning decades. It was like a visual history of the hotel's visitors, a record of everyone who had stayed there. But what disturbed me most was the most recent photograph. It was dated with the exact time the fire had broken out. The photograph showed a group of people in the hotel's lobby, their expressions a mix of joy and unease. I recognized the setting. It was the same lobby that had been reduced to ashes. The names beneath the photograph were unfamiliar, but the date and time were unmistakable, matching the moment when the fire had begun to rage. I felt a surge of fear, the realization that this hidden room held a dark secret. Why would someone keep a record of hotel guests? And why would the most recent photograph match the fire start time? It was as if someone had planned it, orchestrated the fire to erase evidence. But evidence of what I knew, I had to report my findings to the rest of the team. But the sense of foreboding lingered. The hidden room, the photographs, the exact timing of the fire, it all pointed to something sinister, something that went beyond a simple accident. I climbed back up the staircase, my flashlight illuminating the rubble-strewn basement, and called for backup. The other investigators arrived quickly, their expressions grim as I showed them the hidden room and the photographs. They agreed that something was off, that the fire might not have been an accident after all. The evidence was collected, carefully documented, and the authorities were notified to continue the investigation. The old hotel, once a symbol of luxury and elegance, had become a crime scene, its secrets exposed by the fire. The hidden room with its photographs and precise timing suggested a dark conspiracy, one that involved the hotel's guests and perhaps even its staff. As I left the scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something dangerous, something that might put me at risk. The fire was just the beginning, the spark that ignited a deeper mystery. I knew that I had to be cautious, to watch my back, because someone out there had orchestrated this disaster and they wouldn't be pleased that their secret room had been discovered. The ashes held their secrets, and I was determined to find out the truth, no matter the cost. Story 7. Running the night shift at a hotel can be a lonely job. The hallways are empty, the lights dimmed, and the occasional creak from the old building can send shivers down your spine. It was usually quiet, with most guests asleep, leaving me to handle the front desk and any late-night arrivals. But one night, while I was tidying up the lobby, I found something that turned my quiet shift into a waking nightmare. The guest book was tucked away on a lower shelf beneath a stack of brochures and outdated magazines. It was an old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. I hadn't seen it before, but I assumed it was just an old registry, a relic from a time when hotels kept handwritten records of their guests. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the book to flip through the pages. At first, it seemed harmless, just a list of names and dates, each entry neatly written in cursive. The earliest entries were from decades ago, the names of people who had stayed at the hotel long before I started working there. But as I read through the list, I began to notice something unsettling. The names became increasingly familiar, not because I'd seen them in the hotel, but because I'd seen them in the local news. These were names of people who had disappeared or been found dead in the hotel over the years. I felt a chill run down my spine as I continued reading. The guest book wasn't just a list of hotel guests. It was a record of those who had met tragic ends within these walls. The dates next to the names corresponded to the times of their disappearances or deaths, and the more I read, the more I realized that these weren't isolated incidents. The hotel had a history, a dark and deadly history, and I was standing in the middle of it. I tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but the evidence was too compelling. Each name in the book had a story, a tragic event that had made headlines, and here they were, neatly recorded in the guest book. The latest entries were from just a few years ago, suggesting that whatever had come caused these disappearances, and deaths was still happening. I knew I had to report what I had found, but I was hesitant to leave the front desk unattended. The hotel felt different now, the shadows darker, the silence more ominous. I decided to take the guest book with me and head to the security office, where I could call the police and report my discovery. As I made my way through the hotel, the hallway seemed longer, the familiar corners more sinister. Every step echoed. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. I passed by the rooms where some of the tragic events had occurred, the memory of the names in the guest book adding a weight to the air. When I reached the security office, I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found. The dispatcher seemed concerned, asking me to stay on the line and keep the guest book secure. I could hear the distant sound of sirens as the police made their way to the hotel, but the wait felt like an eternity. The police arrived quickly, their presence bringing a sense of urgency to the hotel. They took the guest book and began questioning me about its contents. I told them everything. I knew about the names, the dates, and the connection to the disappearances and deaths. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that this was more than just a simple list of hotel guests. The investigation continued through the night, the hotel becoming a crime scene. As the police examined the guest book in the rooms mentioned, in its pages, the mood among the hotel staff shifted from calm to tense, everyone whispering about the guest book and its dark implications. The night shift, once a quiet and lonely job, had become a haunting experience. I knew I couldn't stay at the hotel, not after what I had found. The guest book, the long list of names, the connection to the tragedies. It was too much to ignore. I resigned from my position, leaving the hotel and its dark history behind. But the memory of the guest book with its eerie list of names would stay with me, a reminder that some places carry secrets that are better left uncovered. Old cemeteries have a unique atmosphere. The solemn silence, the worn gravestones, and the overgrown paths that twist and turn among the moles. I often found myself visiting them, not out of morbid curiosity, but because they offered a quiet escape from the noise of the city. This particular cemetery was one I hadn't explored before. Nestled on the outskirts of town, its wrought iron gates creaking as I pushed them open, the cemetery was a mix of old and new, with ancient stones covered in moss and newer ones gleaming in the afternoon sun. As I wandered among the graves, reading the inscriptions and reflecting on the lives that had come and gone, I noticed a gravestone that seemed out of place. It was a simple stone, unremarkable at first glance. But what caught my attention was the date engraved on it. The date hadn't yet passed. I did a double take, thinking it must be a mistake or a trick of the light. But as I moved closer, I saw it clearly. The date was in the future, a few weeks from now. The name on the stone was familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. It was a common name, one I'd heard before, but it took a moment for me to connect. The dots. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search, trying to find out more about the person buried beneath this stone. What I found was both unsettling and confusing. The name belonged to someone who had died years earlier. The obituary mentioned an accident, a tragic event that had claimed their life, but the date on the gravestone didn't match. It was listed as their birth date, not their death date. I felt a chill run down my spine, the air growing colder as I stood there, staring at the gravestone. How could this be? If the person had died years ago, why was their birthday listed as a future date? It was as if the stone had been changed, the inscription altered to create a deliberate mystery. I looked around the cemetery expecting to see someone watching me, someone who might explain the discrepancy. But the place was deserted. The only sounds, the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. The gravestone stood alone, a haunting reminder that the past could sometimes refuse to stay buried. I decided to investigate further to find out if this was a mistake or something more sinister. I visited the cemetery's caretaker, an old man with a weathered face and a gruff demeanor. I asked him about the gravestone, about this strange date, and the person it belonged to. He seemed puzzled at first, but then his expression changed, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "That stone's been like that for years," he said, his voice low. "Nobody knows who put it there or why. The date doesn't make sense. People say it's cursed, that it's a warning to those who get too close." The caretaker's words sent a shiver through me, the idea of a cursed gravestone with a future date that didn't belong. I asked him if there had been any strange occurrences in the cemetery, anything that might explain the mystery. He just shrugged, muttering about rumors and old legends, but offered no concrete answers. I knew I had to leave to get out of the cemetery before the creeping sense of dread became overwhelming. As I walked back through the old gravestones, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, like unseen eyes were tracking my every move. The gravestone with the future date was a puzzle I couldn't solve, a mystery that refused to be unraveled. I left the cemetery, the gates creaking as I closed them behind me, the wind picking up and sending a chill through the air. The gravestone, with its impossible date and its connection to someone who had died years ago, was a reminder that some places held secrets that were better left undisturbed. The past had a way of reaching into the present, and I knew that whatever lay buried in that old cemetery was a darkness I was better off leaving behind. Story 9. The old factory had been closed for years, its rusted gates creaking in the wind and the windows shattered or boarded up. It was a relic from a time when industry thrived in the area, a monument to a bygone era, now decaying into obscurity. I'd always been fascinated by abandoned places, drawn to the mystery and the stories they held. So when I heard about the factory, I knew I had to explore it. The factory was massive, with towering smokestacks and long corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were covered in graffiti and debris littered the floors. I entered through a broken window, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The air was thick with dust, and the occasional creak from the old machinery added to the eerie atmosphere. As I explored the factory, I came across an old office tucked away in a corner. The door was ajar, and inside, I found a desk covered with papers and stacks of old documents. It looked like the office had been abandoned in a hurry, with files left open and chairs overturned. But what caught my attention was a stack of letters carefully tied together with twine. I picked up the stack and began reading through the letters. Each one was from a different person, but they all mentioned the same thing: a hidden room in the factory where something terrible had happened. The letters spoke of whispers in the walls, of strange sounds that echoed through the factory at night, and of a darkness that seemed to linger long after the factory had closed. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, described a chilling event: a group of workers who had ventured into the hidden room and never returned. The factory management had hushed it up, claiming the workers had left for other jobs, but the letter suggested otherwise. It spoke of blood stains on the floor, of screams that echoed through the factory, and of a sense of dread that hung over the place like a shroud. Another letter mentioned a hidden door cleverly concealed in one of the factory's old storage rooms. The writer described how they had found it by accident, and when they opened it, they felt an overwhelming sense of fear. The door led to a narrow staircase that descended into darkness, and at the bottom was the hidden room, a place where something unspeakable had occurred. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read through the letters. The factory, with its rusted machinery and decaying walls, seemed to hold secrets that were better left undisturbed. But the curiosity was too strong, the desire to uncover the truth too compelling. I decided to find the hidden room to see for myself what the letters were describing. I followed the directions from the letters, navigating through the labyrinthine corridors of the factory. The deeper I went, the more unsettling it became. The walls seemed to close in, and the sounds of the factory grew fainter, replaced by an oppressive silence. I found the old storage room, its door barely hanging on its hinges, and inside I saw the hidden door. The door was made of heavy metal with a large latch that had rusted over time. It took some effort to pry it open, but eventually it creaked, ajar, revealing the narrow staircase described in the letter. The air was colder down here, the walls damp and slick with moisture. I descended the staircase, my flashlight casting long shadows in the darkness. At the bottom, I found the hidden room. It was small, with bare concrete walls and a single flickering light overhead. The floor was stained, darkened patches that suggested something violent had happened here. The sense of dread was overwhelming, the whispers from the letters seeming to come to life in the dark corners of the room. I knew I had to leave, to get out of the factory before whatever had happened in this hidden room reached me. The letters, the hidden room, the stories of tragedy and loss, they were all signs that this place held a darkness that was better left undisturbed. I climbed back up the staircase, my heart racing, and left the factory behind. As I walked away from the factory, the distant sound of sirens filled the air, a reminder that some places are best left alone. The stack of letters, with their haunting tales of the hidden room and the terrible events that had occurred, was a stark reminder that the past sometimes refuses to stay buried. The factory, with its decaying walls and hidden secrets, was a place I would never return to. Story 10, exploring old mansions, had always fascinated me. The towering facades, the hidden corners, and the echoes of a lifelong past had a way of drawing me in. This particular mansion was tucked away in the woods, its overgrown driveway hinting at years of neglect. The locals said it had been abandoned for decades, that it was haunted by the memories of the family who once lived there. But I wasn't easily deterred by stories of ghosts or curses. I was there to explore and uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. The mansion was massive, its stone walls weathered by time, the windows shattered or boarded up. I entered through a broken side door, the hinges creaking with age. Inside, the grand hallways were filled with dust and debris, the remnants of furniture scattered across the floor. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the only light came from the narrow slivers that pierced through the boarded windows. As I made my way through the mansion, I discovered a secret compartment behind an old bookshelf. It was cleverly hidden, the kind of thing you might miss if you weren't paying attention. The compartment was small, just large enough to hold a collection of journals, each one bound in leather and marked with a different year. The journal seemed out of place, untouched by the decay that had consumed the rest of the mansion. I took the journals to a quiet corner, a small room that might have once been a study. The first few entries detailed the daily life of the family who had lived in the mansion, their routines, their gatherings, and the occasional mention of local events. It was a snapshot of a time long past, a glimpse into the lives of people who had long since vanished. But as I read through the journals, I noticed something odd. The dates on the entries spanned decades from the early 1900s to the 1960s. The family had lived in the mansion for generations, their stories unfolding within its walls. Yet as I reached the final journal, the entries took a darker turn. There were mentions of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, unexplained sounds in the night, and the feeling of being watched. The last entry in the final journal was what disturbed me the most. It was dated the day before my visit, despite the mansion being abandoned for decades. The entry was short, just a few lines, but it described an eerie event. A figure seen standing in the grand hallway, its outline barely visible in the dim light. The writer mentioned a sense of grief, dread, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I felt a chill run down my spine as I closed the journal. How could the entry be dated? The day before I visited the mansion had been abandoned for decades with no signs of recent activity. Yet the handwriting was clear, the ink fresh, as if someone had written it just moments before I found it. I knew I had to leave to get out of the mansion before whatever had caused the final journal entry found me. The hidden compartment, the journals, the final entry. It was all too much too uncanny, like a warning that the mansion held secrets that were better left undiscovered. As I made my way back through the grand hallways, the shadows seemed darker, the creaking of the floorboards more pronounced. I passed by the grand staircase, the same one mentioned in the final journal entry, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The air grew colder, the sense of dread more intense, as if the mansion itself was coming to life. I left the mansion, the overgrown driveway crunching beneath my feet, and I didn't look back. The journals with their stories of a family that had lived and died within the mansion's walls, were a stark reminder that the past sometimes refuses to stay buried. The final entry, with its haunting description of a figure in the grand hallway, was a warning that the mansion still held a darkness, one that was better left behind. I knew I would never return to that mansion, never explore its grand hallways or hidden compartments again. The secrets it held were too dark, too unsettling, and the final journal entry suggested that some stories are best left unwritten. The mansion, with its decaying walls and haunting past, was a place I was glad to leave behind. Working the night shift as a security guard at a research facility was usually a quiet job. I was responsible for monitoring the security cameras, checking the doors, and making sure the facility remained secure. It was an uneventful routine, just me and the silence of the night, with the occasional hum of machinery from the labs. But one night, everything changed, and I discovered a hidden camera feed that turned my routine into a waking nightmare. It was a typical night shift, with the usual rounds and the occasional cup of coffee to keep me alert. The security booth was my base of operations, a small room with a desk, a bank of monitors, and a radio for communication with the other guards. The cameras showed various parts of the facility, from the front entrance to the labs and the corridors in between. During one of my breaks, I decided to explore the system, checking for any unused cameras or hidden feeds. I was curious, wondering if there were any blind spots or old cameras that had been forgotten. As I navigated through the system, I stumbled upon a feed that wasn't part of the usual setup. It was labeled Hidden Feed, and it showed footage from the security booth. My security booth. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched the feed. It was from the previous night, showing me sitting at the desk reading a book to pass the time. The footage seemed ordinary at first, just me going about, my usual routine. But then I saw something that made my heart race. There was someone standing behind me in the booth, a shadowy figure that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I froze my hands, trembling as I rewound the footage, hoping to find some explanation. The figure was indistinct, just a shadow in the corner of the frame, but it was unmistakable. It stood there for a few moments watching me, then slowly backed away and vanished into the darkness. I checked the security logs, but there was no record of anyone entering the facility that night. No visitors, no late-night staff, nothing. And panic set in as I realized that someone had breached security without leaving a trace. I checked the other camera feeds, hoping to find any sign of the intruder, but there was nothing. The facility was empty, the corridor silent, and the only person in the booth was me. But the hidden feed showed someone standing behind me without my knowledge. I called my supervisor, my voice shaking, as I explained what I'd found. He seemed puzzled, asking me if I was sure I hadn't just imagined it. I insisted that the footage was real, that someone had been in the facility without being detected. He promised to send backup and told me to stay put until they arrived. The wait felt like an eternity, the silence in the facility growing more oppressive with each passing moment. I kept my eyes on the monitors, expecting the shadowy figure to reappear, but the screens showed nothing but empty corridors and darkened labs. I checked the security booth, the corners where the figure had stood, but there was no sign of anyone else. When the backup guards arrived, we searched the facility, checking every room and corner, but found nothing. The facility was secure, and there was no evidence of forced entry or tampering with the cameras. It was as if the shadowy figure had never been there, as if it had vanished into thin air. The incident left me unnerved. The hidden camera feed, a stark reminder that the facility held its own secrets. The shadowy figure, the breach in security, the lack of any record at all, pointed to something beyond my understanding. I knew I had to be cautious, to stay on high alert, because someone out there knew how to move through the facility without being detected. I asked my supervisor about the hidden feed, but he claimed not to know anything about it. The whole situation felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, each question leading to more uncertainty. I knew I couldn't stay on the night shift, not after what I'd seen. The shadowy figure standing behind me in the booth, it was a haunting reminder that some things lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I transferred to the day shift, where the light of day offered some comfort, but the memory of the hidden camera feed lingered. The research facility, with its dark corners and hidden feeds, was a place where the line between reality and nightmare could easily blur. I was glad to leave the night shift behind, but I knew that the shadowy figure was out there, somewhere watching and waiting. Story 12. Returning to my childhood home was bittersweet. The house had stood empty for years after my parents passed away. Its once vibrant rooms, now quiet and covered in dust. I was tasked with cleaning it out, deciding what to keep and what to let go. It was a daunting job, one that carried the weight of memories and nostalgia. The creaking floorboards and faded wallpaper reminded me of a different time, but I knew that moving forward meant letting go of the past. I started in the attic, sorting through old boxes and stacks of yellow newspapers. The familiar smell of cedar and mothballs filled the air, and I found myself lost in memories as I uncovered childhood toys and forgotten trinkets. It was while I was lifting a box of old books that I noticed a loose floorboard. At first I thought it was just wear and tear, but when I pried it up, I found a set of keys tucked away in a small wooden box. The keys were old, tarnished with age, but each one was distinct with intricate designs etched into the metal. I wondered why they were hidden under the floorboard and what they might unlock. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to test the keys on various doors and locks around the house. I started with the obvious places, closets, cabinets, and the basement door, but none of the keys seemed to fit. It was frustrating, but also intriguing, like a puzzle that needed solving. I moved on to the garage, the garden shed, and even the old storage room in the back. But still, none of the keys worked. It wasn't until I tried the keys on a small door in the hallway that things took a strange turn. The door was hidden behind an old piece of furniture, one that hadn't been moved in years. When I unlocked it, expecting to find a small closet, I was instead greeted with an empty space, a passage that stretched into darkness, leading to a part of the house that wasn't supposed to exist. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stepped into the passage, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The air was colder here, the scent of dust and decay more pronounced. I followed the passage as it twisted and turned, leading to a hidden room at the far end of the house. The room was empty, but the floorboards were clean, as if someone had recently swept them. It was unsettling, the idea that this hidden space had been concealed for so long. I returned to the hallway and tried the keys on other doors, finding more hidden passages in empty spaces. Each one was unique, with its own twists and turns, but they all shared the same eerie silence. It was as if the house itself had been keeping secrets, hiding parts of itself from the outside world. I began to wonder why these hidden spaces existed and what their purpose might have been. The more I explored, the more questions I had. Was there something my parents never told me? Was this house hiding a dark past that I had never known about? The keys seemed to unlock more than just doors. They opened a gateway to a history that had been carefully concealed. As I ventured deeper into the hidden passages, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the creaking of the floorboards felt like footsteps following me. I knew I had to leave to get out of the house before the darkness that had been hidden for so long reached me. I packed up my things and left the house, the keys clutched tightly in my hand. I decided to hand them over to a friend who was an architect, hoping he might have some insight into why these hidden spaces existed. He promised to investigate, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answers. The idea that my childhood home held secrets that I had never known about was too much to bear. The set of keys, the hidden passages, and the empty spaces that weren't supposed to exist were a stark reminder that some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. The memories of my childhood home had changed, overshadowed by the mysteries that I had uncovered. I knew I would never return, never again walk through its creaking hallways, because the house had revealed a darkness that was best left in the past. Story 13. The old lighthouse stood on a rocky cliff overlooking the sea, its once bright paint now faded and peeling. It had long been abandoned, a relic from a bygone era when ships relied on its light to navigate the treacherous waters. I had always been skeptical of ghost stories and haunted tales, but this lighthouse had a reputation for being one of the most haunted places on the coast. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore it for myself. The wind whipped through the tall grass as I made my way up the narrow path to the lighthouse. The air was filled with the scent of salt water and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and rusted railings adding to its eerie charm. I felt a surge of excitement, ready to debunk the ghost stories and prove that the only thing haunting this place was a good imagination. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning with age. Inside, the lighthouse was dark and musty, the faint light from outside barely penetrating the gloom. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam casting erratic patterns on the walls. The interior was a mess, with broken furniture and debris strewn across the floor. It was clear that no one had been here for years. As I explored the lower levels, I came across an old desk tucked away in a corner. It was covered in dust, but a small leather-bound journal caught my eye. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the writing was still legible. I picked it up and began to read, curious to learn about the former lighthouse keeper who had once called this place home. The journal described the daily life of a lighthouse keeper, the maintenance, the isolation, and the occasional storm that tested the structure's strength. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The keeper began to describe strange occurrences. Screams in the night, shadows moving across the rocks, and the feeling of being watched. He mentioned hearing whispers carried on the wind and seeing figures standing on the cliffside, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the journal, the descriptions growing increasingly disturbing. The keeper wrote about sleepless nights unable to rest because of the constant noise and the sense of foreboding that seemed to hang over the lighthouse. He even mentioned seeing figures in the lighthouse itself moving through the corridors when he was alone. As I reached the final entry, the screams began. At first I thought it was my imagination, the journal playing tricks with my mind, but the sound grew louder, echoing off the rocks and filling the lighthouse with a haunting wail. It was a scream, like someone in agony carried on the wind from the cliffside below. My heart raced as I dropped the journal, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I ran to the nearest window, expecting to see something on the rocks, but there was nothing, just the dark sea and the crashing waves. The screams continued, each one piercing and filled with pain. It was as if the voices from the journal had come to life, their tormented cries reaching out from the past. I knew I had to leave to get out of the lighthouse before the screams found me. The journal, the stories of the former lighthouse keeper, the haunting echoes. It was all too much too real. I rushed down the narrow staircase, my footsteps echoing in the cramped space. The screams seemed to follow me, growing louder like a chorus of lost souls crying out for help. As I burst through the lighthouse door and ran down the path, the screams faded, replaced by the distant roar of the sea. The wind whipped around me, carrying the scent of salt water and the remnants of the haunting. The cries. I didn't look back, afraid that I might see the figures from the journal standing on the rocks, watching me as I fled. I reached my car and drove away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The lighthouse, with its decaying walls and broken windows, had revealed a darkness that I couldn't explain. The journal, the screams, the ghostly figures. It was a reminder that some places carry a heavy burden, a history filled with sorrow and loss. I knew I would never return to that lighthouse, never again walk its narrow corridors or peer out at the cliffside below. The haunting screams were too real, too filled with pain, a testament to the tortured souls that still lingered in the shadows of the old lighthouse. Story 14. Investigating a series of home invasions was a grim task. The cases were piling up, each one leaving families shaken and police baffled. The pattern was consistent. The intruders entered without leaving a trace, taking nothing of value, but leaving a sense of fear in their wake. I was a detective assigned to the case, tasked with finding the link between the break-ins and uncovering who was behind them. The latest incident took me to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The home was modest, the kind where kids played in the front yard and neighbors watched out for each other. But the break-in had shattered that sense of security. The owners, an elderly couple, had heard noises in the night, but by the time they called the police, the intruders were gone. I searched the house, looking for any clues or signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were intact, the locks unbroken. It was as if the intruders had appeared and vanished without a trace. But as I made my way to the attic, I noticed something unusual, a small hidden compartment in the rafters. Inside, I found a strange object, a doll, old and worn with a camera embedded in its eye. The doll was unsettling, its porcelain face cracked and faded, but what caught my attention was the camera. It was small, barely noticeable, and clearly designed for surveillance. I took it back to the station and had the tech team extract the footage from the camera's memory. What I saw made my blood run cold. The footage showed various locations around the city, homes, parks, and public places. It was a montage of different scenes, each one recorded from the doll's perspective. But what disturbed me most was when I saw my own apartment on the screen. The footage showed my living room, my kitchen, even my bedroom. The doll had been there recording without my knowledge. I felt a surge of fear, the realization that I had been watched, that my privacy had been violated. The footage was recent, recorded just a few days before the latest home invasion. It was clear that the doll was part of a larger network used to gather information and track the movements of potential targets. I shared my findings with the rest of the team, and we quickly realized that the home invasions were part of a coordinated effort. The doll was used to scout locations, to identify vulnerabilities, and track the routines of the residents. It was a surveillance tool hidden in plain sight, and it had been moving through the city without detection. The investigation took on a new urgency. We needed to find out who was behind the doll, who had placed it in the attic, and why my apartment was on the list of locations. I started to feel paranoid, wondering if other hidden cameras were watching me, tracking my every move. The sense of safety that came with being a detective was shattered, replaced by a constant feeling of being observed. We traced the origins of the doll to a local pawn shop where it had been sold to an unknown buyer. The shopkeeper couldn't remember who had purchased it, but he mentioned that it was part of a collection, a series of similar dolls that had come from an estate sale. The estate belonged to a man who had a history of surveillance and voyeurism, but he had died young years earlier. The deeper we dug, the more tangled the web became. The doll was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that seemed to stretch across the city and involve more people than we had anticipated. The home invasions were part of a Network A system designed to exploit the vulnerability of ordinary people and turn their lives into a source of surveillance. I knew I had to be careful to watch my back, because the doll with the camera in its eye suggested that I was not immune to this network's reach. The investigation was ongoing, but the fear lingered. The sense that someone was always watching. My apartment no longer felt like a safe haven, and I began to question every shadow, every noise in the night. The home, invisible invasions, the hidden doll, and the network of surveillance were a stark reminder that even the most ordinary places could hide dark secrets. The doll had opened a door to a world I had never imagined, a world where privacy was an illusion and safety was never guaranteed. I knew that unraveling this network would take time, but I was determined to find out who was behind it and bring them to justice. Story 15. I'd always been drawn to the forgotten and hidden crevices of the world. So when I took the job as a groundskeeper at the old university, it wasn't just the sprawling lawns and ancient trees that called to me. It was the secrets that such places always seemed to hold. It was during a routine clearing out of an old maintenance shed that I stumbled upon something that would first forever change my perception of the campus. Behind stacks of rusty tools and dusty tarps, I found a wooden chest. Inside, amid various discarded items, lay an old map. It was brittle and yellowed, but clearly detailed. A series of tunnels beneath the campus. The map was a labyrinth of lines with markings and notes scrawled in a faded ink. There was an air of mystery that whispered to me from the paper, an invitation to explore the unknown. I asked around the professors, the administrative staff, even the oldest of the janitorial team. None of them knew were admitted to knowing about any underground tunnels. Their ignorance, or was it denial, only fueled my curiosity. I had to see for myself. What lay beneath the entrance, according to the map, was behind the boiler room of the oldest building on campus. It took me several nights of poking around under the guise of inspecting the old heating system to find it. A false wall, cleverly disguised to look like the rest of the foundation, hid a narrow descending staircase. I remember pausing the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand as I considered turning back, but the allure of the unknown was too strong. The air grew cooler as I descended. The walls, initially rough and crudely hewn, soon became smoother, as if molded by careful hands or perhaps by time itself. The tunnel stretched on, forking and winding in ways that seemed to deviate from the map. Every now and then, my markings etched into the stone seemed to serve as cryptic guideposts. It was deeper in the labyrinth that I found the room. It was perfectly circular, the walls lined with shelves filled with dusty bottles, strange metallic instruments, and piles of leather-bound journals. In the center stood a stone table atop which lay a large open book. Its pages were filled with diagrams and writings in a language I didn't recognize, accompanied by illustrations that twisted my stomach with unease. The drawings depicted creatures humanoid, but distorted with elongated limbs and sunken, empty eyes. As I flipped through the pages, the air grew thick-heavy with the smell of damp and decayed. A sound began to echo through the tunnels, a faint dragging shuffle. I snapped the book shut, and the sound ceased. Heart hammering, I decided it was time to leave. I retraced my steps, the silence oppressive, broken only by my own heavy breathing. But as I neared the exit, the shuffling returned louder this time, accompanied by a low, moaning wail. Panic clawed at my chest. I broke into a run, the map, forgotten my only thought to reach the light of the surface. I emerged into the boiler room, gasping for air, the door slamming shut behind me. I leaned against it, listening. After a moment, the sounds faded, swallowed by the depths of the earth. I never went back, and I never spoke of what I'd found. The map was burned, its ashes scattered to the winds. Weeks later, I resigned from my position, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, of whispers carried on the wind. The university remained its secrets, buried deep beneath layers of stone, in silence, its whispers only a memory in my mind. Yet sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the faint, dragging shuffle of something unseen, forever roaming the darkness below. The historic district of Old Willow's Lane was known for its picturesque Victorian houses, each with its own story and secrets buried in the creaking wood and peeling paint. As a first-time homebuyer with a penchant for the past, I was drawn to these homes, eager to breathe new life into one of them. That's how I found myself standing at the threshold of a particularly forlorn-looking property, its windows boarded up, ivy clawing its way up the faded siding. The realtor who had handed me the keys, with a mix of reluctance and relief, mentioned that the house had stood empty for years. "It's a fixer-upper," she had said, a term that Hughes seemed an understatement. As I pushed open the heavy front door, the air inside greeted me with the musty smell of abandonment. I wandered through the rooms, each step stirring up ghosts of dust motes into the shafts of light slicing through the boarded windows. It was in the living room that I first noticed the footprints. They were fresh, the edges sharp and clear in the thick layer of dust on the hardwood floor. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here recently. Curiosity piqued. I followed the trail. It meandered through the house, skirting around an old grand piano, beneath a chandelier, teetering precariously by a thread, and then to a small hallway closet. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, instead of the expected shelves or old coats there, was a ladder, its top disappearing into a dark void above. The house's blueprints, old and brittle, had shown no indication of a space above this closet. It was as if someone had added it without a trace, hidden from view and forgotten by all but one. With a mixture of fear and intrigue, I climbed the ladder, each rung groaning on my weight. The space at the top was cramped and pitch black. Fumbling with my flashlight, I illuminated an attic-like room, its low ceiling pressing down heavy with shadows. It was empty, save for a small dusty trunk in one corner. The air was stifling thick with the scent of old fabric and wood. There was something unsettling about the room's sense of interrupted privacy, as if I had stumbled into a secret still in the making. As my light swept across the walls, I noticed marking scratches that formed words. Never alone, read one, the letters jagged and frantic. They watch warned another. The simplicity of the messages scrawled in desperation sent a shiver through me. I approached the trunk, the air around me growing colder, denser. Inside, I found an assortment of objects, a few old books with tattered covers, a broken pocket watch, and a small black and white photo of a woman, her expression's somber eyes hauntingly familiar, as if I had seen her somewhere before. As I picked up the photo, the floorboards below creaked loudly, a sound out of place in the stillness. Panicked, I hurried back to the ladder, descended with shaky legs, and rushed through the house, the footprints I had followed now overlaid with my own in a chaotic dance. Once outside, I breathed deeply, trying to shake off the claustrophobia and dread that clung to me. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. As I turned for one last look at the house, I saw movement behind. A second-story window, the flicker of a curtain. Though all had been boarded up, my heart seized. There was no denying it. The house, though abandoned, was far from empty. I returned the keys to the realtor the next morning, recounting none of what I had discovered. She seemed eager to be rid of the house, her eyes darting away from mine as she spoke of other properties that might suit me. But as I left, I glanced back at her office window. There, pinned to the bulletin board, was the same photo I had found in the trunk. The woman's solemn eyes watched me go, a silent guardian of her domain, and a reminder that some secrets are best left undisturbed. Story 17. The public library in our small town was an unassuming building, tucked away between the bustling cafe and the dormant railway station. It was my refuge, a place where I could immerse myself in the quiet world of books, away from the monotonous drone of everyday life. My research on local history had brought me here countless times, but today, as I browsed through the familiar aisles, a narrow section caught my eye, one I had never noticed before. The books here were older, their spines thick with dust as if untouched for decades. Intrigued, I pulled out a volume, its leather cover cracked and worn. The title was faded, barely legible, but it hinted at local legends and folklore. Folklore. It was exactly the kind of material I needed for my research, yet something felt off. These books didn't belong here among the well-thumbed volumes of popular history and biography that populated the rest of the library. As I opened the book, a cloud of dust puffed into the air, making me cough. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded to a dull brown. What I expected to be a collection of ghost stories or tall tales instead presented itself as a detailed account of missing persons cases that had never been solved. Stretching back over a century, each entry was meticulously documented. Names, dates, and last known locations. But most chilling of all, the exact spots where their bodies were eventually found. These were not public records or newspaper articles. They read more like personal notes, perhaps from a detective or a morbidly fascinated historian. As I turned the pages, a cold sensation crept up my spine. The descriptions were too detailed, too intimate to be mere observations. One entry in particular caught my attention. A case from 50 years ago involving a young woman named Eliza Grafton, who had vanished while walking home from the very cafe that now neighbored the library. Her body was found weeks later in the woods behind the railway station, an area now obscured by overgrowth and neglect. The entry noted specific details about the state of her clothing, the arrangement of the leaves around her body, and a peculiar, unexplained symbol carved into a nearby tree. Compelled by a mix of horror and curious curiosity, I continued to explore the rest of the section. Each book contains similar records, each entry more unsettling than the last. These weren't just records. They were confessions hidden in plain sight. Who had written these? Why were they placed here in a public library, masquerading as folklore? With a growing sense of unease, I checked the library's catalogue, but none of these books were listed. It was as if they existed in a void acknowledged by no one but now, disturbingly by me. The librarian, an elderly woman who had always greeted me with a nod and a smile, suddenly seemed a stranger. When I approached her to inquire about the books, her face paled. Oh, those. I thought they had been removed years ago, she whispered, her voice trembling. They were donated anonymously. We were supposed to dispose of them, but it seems they were misplaced, instead disposed. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They frighten people. Some who read them claim they see things, hear voices from those who are no longer with. Her eyes darted around the library as if afraid of being overheard. Please put them back and forget you ever found them. Ignoring her plea, I took several books back to my table. The more I read, the clearer it became. These books were a puzzle, each piece revealing horrors that someone somewhere had documented with disturbing clarity. My research took a new direction. I needed to find out who had written these entries and why. Days turned into weeks. I became a regular fixture in the library, my presence tolerated but clearly not welcomed. Patrons began to avoid me, whispering behind hushed hands as they passed. The librarian watched me with wary eyes, but said nothing more. One evening, as I pored over an entry about a man who had disappeared in the 1980s, I found a small folded note tucked between the pages. In neat cursive writing, it read, "Stop looking. Some truths are best left buried." That night, I took the books back to their forgotten shelf, my hands shaking as I placed them exactly where I'd found them. As I left the library, the wind seemed to carry whispers through the trees, the voices of those lost souls chronicled in my hands. I knew then that I would never return, my thirst for knowledge drowned by the weight of a darker, more perilous truth. Story 18. My job as a crime scene photographer has shown me the darkest corners of human nature, but nothing could have prepared me for the call to a remote cabin now nestled deep in the Harper Woods. It was late autumn, the trees a cacophony of crimson and gold, the air crisp and carrying the first hint of winter's chill. The drive was long, the winding dirt road seemingly unending as it cut through the dense forest. Arriving at the scene, I saw the cabin, a rustic log structure that looked like it had stood there for centuries, isolated and eerie. The local police were already there, their faces somber, eyes avoiding mine. "It's a bad one," the sheriff muttered as he handed me the camera. That was all the briefing I received as I entered the cabin. The smell hit me first, a sickening mix of iron and decay. The living room was a chaos of overturned furniture and broken glass. Blood spatters painted the walls and floors, telling tales of terror and desperation. My hands steadied the camera, capturing every detail with mechanical precision and necessary detachment that my job required. But it was the wall opposite the fireplace that drew my attention and halted my practiced routine. There, amidst the carnage, hung a series of Polaroid photos, each pinned with a rusty nail. The images were haunting. Each photo captured a moment of attack, the subjects caught in expressions of fear and agony. My heart raced as I documented each photograph, the flash of my camera casting eerie shadows around the dimly lit room. It was the last photo that made my blood run cold. There, in vivid color, was an image of me. I was in my familiar dark jacket, the one I was wearing at that very moment, my face twisted in an expression of horror as an unseen assailant seemed to push me against a wall. But I had never been to this place before, had never experienced such an attack. The realization that I was looking at a moment from a potential future, a threat made manifest in Polaroid, sent a shiver down my spine. I called the sheriff over, pointing to the photo. His face, already pale, turned a shade whiter. "This doesn't make any sense," he stammered, examining the picture as if it might change under scrutiny. "You better take these with you," he decided, gesturing to the wall of photos. "Maybe the lab can make something of it." The drive back was a blue blur, my mind racing as much as my car along the dark, tree-lined roads. At home, I locked the doors and sat down with the photographs spread out before me. The images of the other victims were unknown to me, their fates clearly sealed, captured in their final terrifying moments. But my photo was different. It was a warning, a premonition, or a sick joke. Joke by someone who knew me too well. Sleep eluded me that night, and many nights after. I pored over the photos, searching for any clue that might explain how I could be both victim and witness, how my image could have ended up on that wall. The local police were investigating, but leads were scarce, the cabin having been rented out to various individuals over the years, none staying long, none leaving much behind. And weeks passed, and the tension grew. I started noticing things. A car that seemed to linger too long outside my house. Unfamiliar footprints in the soft earth of my backyard. Shadows that moved just beyond the reach of streetlights. Paranoia gripped me, tightening its hold with every strange noise and fleeting shadow. Then, one evening, as I sat reviewing the photos, once again, I noticed something in the background of my Polaroid. Partly obscured by the angle of the shot was a reflection in a mirror. A face, partially hidden, camera in hand. The realization dawned on me with chilling clarity. The photographer of my impending doom was not just recording these moments, they were orchestrating them. Armed with this new evidence, I contacted the police. They acted swiftly, enhancing the image, tracing it back to a former crime scene photographer who had disappeared from public view years ago, suspected of tampering with crime scenes he was supposed to document. The theory was that he had become obsessed with the macabre, staging his own scenes to capture the horror he once only recorded. A raid on his last known address led to a harrowing chase through the underbelly of the city, culminating in his capture. In an abandoned warehouse, a makeshift studio of horror found within the photos on the wall were his gallery, his victims, his art. I was meant to be his masterpiece. The crime scene photographer turned into a final, grotesque exhibit. But with his arrest, that future was rewritten. Still, sometimes when the light fades and the shadows grow long, I feel the cold grip of what might have been, and I remind myself of the thin line between observer and participant, between documenting darkness and being consumed by it. The winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains have always held a mysterious allure for me. That day, with the autumn leaves painting the hills in fiery hues, I was driving through a particularly remote mountain pass, a shortcut I hoped would shave a few hours off my long journey home. The road was narrow and curving, hemmed in by looming glyphs and dense woods. As I rounded a sharp bend, a road sign, old and partially obscured by overgrown vines, caught my attention. It pointed down a gravel path barely visible from the main road. "Welcome to Elkmont at Reed," with an arrow gesturing toward what appeared to be nothing more than a break in the trees. I had driven this route many times and never noticed this sign, nor was Elkmont marked on any map I owned. Curiosity overcame caution, and I turned onto the path. The road was rough, more a series of potholes than a continuous surface, and the woods seemed to close in around me. After what felt like miles, the trees suddenly cleared, and I found myself on the outskirts of a village. Elkmont was eerily silent. The village consisted of a dozen buildings, arranged around a central square with a dry fountain. Each structure bore the weight of abandonment windows, boarded up or shattered doors, hanging off hinges, roofs sagging under the burden of neglect. Yet there was something unsettling about the desolation. It felt staged, like a scene from a movie left behind. After the cameras had stopped rolling, I parked near the square and stepped out of my car, the silence oppressive, broken only by the rustle of the wind through the autumn leaves. My footsteps echoed off the empty buildings as I ventured further into the village. It was then that I checked my GPS, intending to mark the location for later exploration. To my surprise, the screen showed recent activity, a cluster of digital markers indicating movement and heat signatures from just a few days ago. Perplexed, I walked toward the largest building, which appeared to have once been a town hall. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of light, filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Papers and furniture were strewn about as if the inhabitants had left in a hurry. On a decayed bulletin board, flyers fluttered in the draft. Notices for community events dated years ago. Their edges curled and faded. As I explored further, I found personal items: a child's doll, a pair of glasses, a book left open, as if waiting for its reader to return. It was as if the villagers had vanished, leaving their lives suspended in time. But the GPS data haunted me, suggesting that someone or something was still here, perhaps watching. I decided to investigate the homes surrounding the square. Each house told a similar story of abrupt departure, meals left uneaten on tables, clothes still hanging on lines, photos of smiling families gazing out from dusty frames. The air grew colder, the sky outside darkening as if storm clouds were rolling in. Then in a house on the far edge of the village, I found something different. An office with walls covered in maps and photos, red lines connecting points and dates circled. It was a research station, or so it seemed. Notebooks filled with observations lay scattered about, and a large ham radio setup indicated someone had been communicating with the outside world, or at least trying to. The last entry in the nearest notebook was dated just one day prior to my visit. It spoke of a phenomenon, an anomaly in the area that caused disorientations and temporal discrepancies. The writer theorized that Elkmont was not just abandoned. It was caught in a flux, visible only intermittently to the outside world, trapped by some unknown force. A chill ran down my spine as the implications settled in. I was about to leave to run back to my car and never return when a sudden movement outside caught my eye. Through the window I saw figures moving swiftly between the building's shadows at the edge of vision. They were there, and then not flickers of existence that teased the periphery of my sight. Panicking, I dashed back to my car, the echo of my footsteps too loud in the empty village. As I started the engine, the GPS blinked out the screen, going black. Before flickering back to life, the map empty of any markers Elkmont erased, as if it had never been there. Driving away, the road behind me seemed to disappear into the thickening fog. My heart pounded with the terror of the unknown, the rear-view mirror reflecting nothing but the dense woods, swallowing the path that had led me to that forgotten village. I drove on the memory of Elkmont, already fading like a dream upon waking, vivid yet unreal, haunting yet unreachable.